Building it brick by brick.
Hello everyone, I am Jacqueline Luqman and this is Brick by Brick. Tonight we are on part 3. I am Jacqueline Luqman and this is Brick by Brick. Tonight we are on I think I've solved that problem. So tonight we are on part 3 of the series that I started a few weeks ago called Standing Rock. History shows us that Standing Rock is not new. So tonight I'm going to talk about the Spanish conquest of the Caribbean. I'm going to wrap that up really quickly because we were talking about that last week. And I'm going to go into the British colonization of North America because that's sort of how it all started with Native Americans. So what do we do? What are we talking about when we're talking about the wrapping up the Spanish conquest of the Caribbean and Mexico? The Spanish did eventually make inroads into North America, but it wasn't Christopher Columbus. It was actually through a couple of different explorers, one named De Soto in 1522. He further solidified the Spanish position in the Western Hemisphere by traveling all through pretty much what we now know is the South and a lot of the South, some of the Southwest. And I'm going to show you a map of where De Soto traveled in his exploration. So you can see there were no divisions of states yet. There was just all of this open land, and all of these areas are where the explorer, the Spanish explorer De Soto, in his expedition, there were two groups of expeditions in the De Soto expedition. This is all of the territory that they covered in the Americas. So we're talking about the southeastern area here down in what we know today as Florida, the southern coastal states, down here to the southwestern states. But De Soto wasn't the only Spanish discoverer who made inroads into North America. There was another Spaniard, Francisco Vasquez de Coronado. He set out from Mexico in 1540 in search of the mythical 7 cities of Cibola. I know you've heard of that myth at some point, but Coronado's travels are very interesting because they took him to what we know today as the Grand Canyon and Kansas. Now, he never found, this golden city of Cibola that he was looking for, but his party did leave something very, very interesting, and that lasted and made an indelible impression on the American landscape to this day. And here you see a map of the Coronado expedition. He went, like I said, all the way up here into Kansas and happened upon the Grand Canyon. So that's he and further into the Western Territory. So the interesting thing about the Coronado expedition was that some of the horses he brought over with him on his ship managed to escape their oversea, I guess, and the Plains Indians got a hold of the horses. So within a few generations, because of those few horses that escaped from the Coronado expedition, the Plains Indians had become masters of horsemanship. And that greatly expanded their range, the range of their activities in their territory. That was all due to a few horses escaping the Coronado expedition. Now, like I said last week, the Spanish were brutal and duplicitous in their dealings with the indigenous North Americans, because one of Spain's goals was to civilize the New World by recreating its own society wherever Spanish travelers or explorers went. So, in practice, however, Spanish society in the New World looked nothing like the Spain of the Old World. It was because it was separated by an ocean and thousands of miles. The political will of the king and the ecclesiastical will of the pope were barely recognizable where the Spanish colonies existed, and they were Christian in name only. The requiremento was a document that was read aloud in Spanish, of all things, to the inhabitants of any newly encountered settlements. This is how duplicitous they were. This document announced alleged peace and protection for those choosing to submit to Spanish rule, and it promised war upon those who resisted. The requiremento was read in Spanish. None of the people the Spanish colonized knew Spanish. But they believed that as long as they stated their intentions, by the letter of the law, they were meeting the obligation they needed to meet to give people an opportunity to submit to their will or die by their hand. The requiremento system required each local male to work 9 months of the year for the Spanish encomendero, or village commander, to build churches, roads, irrigation projects, etc., in return for eventual Spanish citizenship, protection, and church instruction and membership. So it wasn't just you convert to the Catholic faith or the Christian faith and we give you protection. No, it's 9 months of working hard labor for us to build our infrastructure, and then we'll give you protection and Spanish citizenship and membership in the church. So, of course, widespread abuses occurred, and the abuses were so bad, just as in the case last week. There were Franciscan missionaries who were appalled at the behavior of the Spanish colonists, and they complained to both the king and the pope. The pope intervened, saying that the locals were not animals. These were the locals in the North American territories. They were not animals, and they could not be enslaved. That's what the pope said. Nor have their property taken away. However, being an ocean and thousands of miles away from the authority of king and pope, the church wasn't the authority in the Spanish colonies in the New World. The military was. So the abuses continued. Now, as Spain was colonizing some parts of North America, France was also seeking to profit in the New World. But interestingly enough, France conducted itself differently from the Spanish in regard to native North Americans. Because the French they did make a halting, unsure foray into the New World for most of a century before establishing a permanent residence. The French kind of hung out a little bit. They wanted to get a lay of the land. They wanted to see what was going on. They wanted to see what kind of people were there. They wanted to see if this foray into colonizing the New World was worth the trouble. So eventually, in 1524, an Italian mariner was hired to explore the east coast of North America. 10 years later, Jacques Cartier found the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, and in 1535 he returned again and probed the river all the way up to modern day Montreal. Have you ever wondered why Quebec is French? That's why. Finally, in 1603, Samuel de Champlain established both a settlement at Montreal and trade with the Huron peoples. Unknowingly, by allying with the Huron, the French had stumbled into one of the greatest North American rivalries in history. The Iroquois were arch enemies of the Huron and had now just become sworn enemies of the unwitting French. This was the kind of thing that the French were trying to avoid. So the French, in their reticence to get involved in meddling too much with indigenous people outside of trade, that's really all they wanted to do, the French tended to leave less of a footprint on the land and the culture than the Spanish before them and the English that came after them, because there was no gold to mine. There was no compelling reason to enslave North Americans, not for the French. So because they were so far north, the climate didn't lend itself to farming as a large-scale alternative. So again, no forced labor would be imposed on the locals. Also, the gathering of fur, which was done on a much greater scale by the French, was done much more and much more easily when others were willing to participate in the practice, and everybody benefited from it. That was the French perspective. And finally, the French believed that cutting down the forests to build large settlements and farms would destroy the fur habitat. So the French figured out that by working more or less in harmony with the pre-existing population, adapting some of their ways, and engaging in a free cultural and economic exchange, their purposes were much better served. They made a lot more money just by working with the native people. As a matter of fact, the French were known to intermarry with native tribes that they traded with, and they adopted the cultures, and they flourished in the northern parts of North America. The French left an indelible cultural mark in North America through religion and their mere presence. The French were also Catholic, like Spain, brought missions and missionaries to New France. The Jesuits showed an uncommon patience and sensitivity in learning indigenous ways. Again, the French just really wanted successful, profitable trade for everyone. And the church wanted to make that money too. So to the extent that these didn't conflict with the faith, the French were fine with adopting some of the indigenous cultural ways. And they generally did not force their religions upon the North Americans that they encountered, which is why there is not an enormous focus on religion in North America today. So, now we come to England. Because in the wake of the Protestant Reformation that began in 1517 by Martin Luther in England, British commoners seeking freedom from political and religious persecution sailed for North America. But that's the popular story. That's the easy story. Really, it was mostly about, what else? Money and power. When Queen Mary died in 1558, her sister Elizabeth cautiously urged England back toward Protestantism for the nearly half century of her reign. Now, I know these are new people, and I cannot go into the history of Bloody Queen Mary, or Queen Bloody Mary, as she was called, and her sister Elizabeth, and Henry the Eighth. I can't go into that history and the history of the Reformation here, but I want to impress upon you how interconnected these eras in history, these movements in history are to the history of this country. We look at the Protestant Reformation of the Catholic Church, or from the Catholic Church, as only relevant to the history of America insofar as religion is concerned. But the Protestant Reformation had a direct impact on the creation of America as a country itself. And this is how. From this point forward, after the death of Queen Mary in 1558, England would remain a Protestant nation, though not without several Catholic challenges for years. There was this fight in England between whether they were going to be Protestant or whether they were going to be Catholic. And at certain times, the Catholic king would imprison Protestants. And then the Protestant king would imprison Catholics. And this went on, back and forth, for years and years and years. Increasingly, the English perspective was that the New World was falling to Catholicism, because remember, the new queen now is a Protestant. She's trying to move England in the direction of Protestantism. Doesn't like Catholicism, doesn't like that the New World is inhabited by a bunch of Catholics. Not because she hates Catholics so much, but because of the power that the Catholic Church is generating through the profit they are making from colonizing the New World. So Queen Elizabeth decides to give permission to write a patent for English explorers to take the Protestant faith to the New World. Because she figured, should not England also establish a presence in the New World to stop the spread of Catholic authority, mind you? So, in 1578, Humphrey Gilbert, who was the author of a treatise on the search for the Northwest Passage, received a patent from Queen Elizabeth to colonize what, this is the actual quote from the patent that Queen Elizabeth read and signed, to colonize the heathen and barbarous lands in the New World, which other European nations had not yet claimed. It would be 5 years before Gilbert's efforts would begin. He was lost at sea when he finally set out. But then his half-brother, Walter Raleigh, and I know these names are starting to sound familiar to you. His half-brother, Walter Raleigh, took up the mission. In 1585, Raleigh established the first British colony in North America on Roanoke Island, off the coast of North Carolina. Excuse me, I'm tongue-tied because my mouth is dry. There we go. Now, the Roanoke colony was later abandoned, and a second effort 2 years later also proved a failure. There's a lot of superstitious myth around the Roanoke colony. No one knows what happened to those people. They just literally kind of disappeared. That story is the fodder for a lot of great ghost stories. But I'm thinking of what we talked about last week, and the destruction of the La Navidad fort that Christopher Columbus left when he went back to Spain after his first expedition into Haiti. That's just conjecture on my part, but I find it a very interesting comparison, and I don't think it's a stretch to consider that's a possibility too. So it would be 20 years, though, 20 years after Humphrey Gilbert finally set off to the Americas, 20 years after his half brother, Walter Raleigh, finally landed off the coast of North Carolina before the Jamestown colony would actually be established in 1607. The colony succeeded, and of course, North America would enter a whole new era. Now, this is where this made up love story between Englishman John Smith and Powhatan Indian princess Pocahontas comes in. It's a ridiculous Disney love story, and it is a much longer, much complicated story, much more complex story than is usually presented. I can't go into all of the detail here. I am going to provide you links to all of this information so you can read the truth for yourself. What is important about this story of Jamestown that isn't told is the way the Powhatan Indians saved the lives of the British colonists, but they weren't treated very kindly in return. So by the winter of 1608, 1609, the English visited various Powhatan tribes to trade beads and other trinkets for more corn because they were starving, only to find a severe drought had drastically reduced the tribe's harvests. In addition, Powhatan's official policy for his chieftain, Powhatan was the chief of the Powhatan Indians, for his chieftain was to cease trading with the English. Because at this point, Chief Powhatan had gotten tired of the English always coming to him asking for food. Because they came here not knowing what the climate was like, not knowing how to sustain themselves in a new agricultural setting. And they couldn't. They relied on the Indians for sustenance during the winter months. The settlers were demanding more food than his people had to spare, so the English began threatening the tribes and burning towns to get food. Chief Powhatan sent a message to John Smith telling him, okay, fine, if you bring swords, guns, hens, copper, beads, and a grindstone, we will fill your ship up with corn. So Smith and his men visit Powhatan to make the exchange and ended up stranding their barge. Negotiations didn't go well. Powhatan excused himself. Then he and his family, including Pocahontas, departed into the woods, unbeknownst to Smith and his men. According to Smith in his journal, that night Pocahontas returned. That night Pocahontas returned to the camp to warn John Smith that her father was going to kill him. So according to John Smith, Pocahontas saved him twice. Now, afterwards, Pocahontas disappears into the woods. She never sees John Smith in Virginia again. But relations between Chief Powhatan and the English continued to deteriorate because they kept asking them for food. Chief Powhatan decided to move his capital from the York River further inland. Pocahontas was not allowed to visit Jamestown anymore. And in the fall of 1609, John Smith left Virginia because of a severe gunpowder wound. At some point, he got shot. So here you have a people who helped the British survive. And instead of asking, how do we sustain ourselves? Show us how you do what you do to feed yourself. They demand food. They demand that the native people in this area who saved their lives continue to save their lives. And if you don't, we'll burn your villages down. That's the thanks. That is the thanks the Powhatan Indians got from John Smith and the English settlers. So that's the Jamestown colony. We all know the rest of the history from the Jamestown colony. Virginia flourished because of that colony. So let's go over to Massachusetts and Plymouth Rock. Because the British land at Plymouth Rock and land on the Wampanoag Indians. Much is made about the first Thanksgiving at the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts in 1620. The 101 women and children, mostly Puritans, who were, again, fleeing religious persecution from England and, interestingly enough, economic persecution in Holland. Because this group of people left England to go to Holland, where they thought they'd have a better life, but the Dutch relegated them to low-paying jobs where they couldn't sustain themselves, so they got angry and decided to go to the New World. They all but died from exposure and disease that first winter here in North America, were it not for the Wampanoag Indians teaching them how to grow maize. But you won't hear much about how they learned to grow maize. How do you learn a technological or agricultural skill from a people you don't share a language with? Did you ever ask yourself that question when you were told this half story in school? I did. I was a weird kid that way. Well, what you are not told about this story is that the reason the Indians were able to teach the English how to grow maize is because Squanto, the Wampanoag Indian who taught them, was actually captured by John Smith and taken to England. That's where he learned the English language, and that is how he was able to communicate with the English settlers. As a matter of fact, it was John Smith who forced Squanto to be a guide for him. So the Thanksgiving holiday that's intended to celebrate the pilgrims supposedly expressing thanks for surviving their first year of settlement after fleeing England is just a half story. So, because many pilgrims were absolutely escaping religious persecution, and they were escaping economic hardship also. But the reality is that the Plymouth colony especially was a profit-generating machine and an imperial outpost for the British Empire. Spain, France, and Holland had already come to the Americas. So this was, of course, by any means necessary, including at the expense of an entire people who were already here. The British had to make their money. So this group of people came to the Plymouth colony as part of a commercial venture. One of the very first things they did, this is the proof of the lack of goodwill they had, one of the very first things they did when they arrived on Cape Cod, before they even actually made it to Plymouth, was to rob the Wampanoag graves at Cornhill and steal as much of the Indians' winter provisions as they were able to carry. Does that Thanksgiving story make sense to you anymore? Over the years, the settlers, even after they were assisted by the Wampanoag Indians, performed terrible, terrible violence against them. In 1636, after a man was found dead on a boat in Plymouth, the Pequot tribe was immediately blamed. And forgive me, everyone, if I'm mispronouncing any of these names. Please correct me. Send me a message on Brick by Brick and correct me. But forgive me if I'm mispronouncing any of these tribal names. I mean absolutely no disrespect. The English major, John Mason, gathered his soldiers and proceeded to kill over 400 Pequot Indians to punish them for the murder. No proof. Appalled at such savagery, the governor of Massachusetts Bay, William Newell, proclaimed, listen, from that day forth shall be a day of celebration and thanksgiving for subduing the Pequots. Oh, did you think he was appalled at the savagery of his own fellow Englishmen? No, he was appalled at the alleged savagery of 400 Pequot Indians for the death of one Englishman. And there was no proof that any Indian had committed that crime. So, of course, none of this happened without resistance, right? The best known resistance among the Native Americans was led by Wampanoag leader Metacomet, also known as King Philip to the English settlers. Between the years of 1675 and 1678, Metacomet led a war against the settlers after the colonists continued to intrude upon their land and their sovereignty, and breaking agreements repeatedly that they had made. As a matter of fact, here is an account of some of what Metacomet did. Massasoit, who had done so much to help the Pilgrims, had a son named Metacomet. As time went on and more Europeans arrived and took more land, Metacomet, or Prince Philip as he came to be known, and other tribal people began to take notice of self-serving ethics of the Pilgrims. After Metacomet's father, Massasoit, died in 1662, Metacomet was crowned King Philip of the Pokanoket by the Europeans. King Philip formed an alliance to remove the European settlers from their homeland. In 1675, after a series of arrogant actions by the colonists, King Philip led his Indian Confederacy into a war meant to save the tribes from extinction. But of course, because the Native people were outnumbered and their technology was not as advanced as the English settlers, they were decimated. I have to adjust my camera a little bit here, you guys. There, that's better. So, ironically, the first European settlers, like we said, were fleeing political and religious persecution in their home as a result of the political fights over whether England would be a Catholic nation or a Protestant nation during the Reformation period. Most European immigrants left to escape political oppression, the freedom to practice their religion, or for adventure and opportunities denied at home. Between 1620 and 1635, economic difficulty swept England. Many people couldn't find work. Even skilled artisans could earn a little money, but little more than just the bare bones. Nobody could really support themselves unless they were royalty. Poor crop yields added to the distress. And in addition, the Industrial Revolution is creating a burgeoning textile industry. Landlords enclosed farmlands and evicted the peasants in favor of sheep cultivation. So colonial expansion became suddenly an outlet for this displaced peasant population. So the colonists who came here, when they first saw the new land, what they saw was a vista of dense woods. But they might not have survived had it not been for the help of friendly Indians who helped them to grow crops that were native to this land: pumpkins, squash, beans, corn. And then in addition, there were vast forests as far as the eye could see along the eastern seaboard, providing all of this rich source for game and firewood and raw materials for building houses and furniture and profitable cargoes for export. And the colonists came here and basically saw a gold mine where they couldn't find an actual gold mine. By the 1700s, English colonists had practically invaded North America, pushing native peoples off land they had inhabited for centuries. There was some trading with European settlers, but there was also resistance from the Native Americans to the Europeans greed for land. See, at first, when the Native Americans traded with European settlers, there were some advantages in that Native Americans were able to get better quality knives or axes or weapons or cooking utensils. So some Indians who were able to trade peacefully with some early English settlers had kind of an advantage over their rivals who didn't. But in response to European demands, tribes such as the Iroquois began to devote more attention to fur trapping in the 17th century. So furs and pelts provided tribes the means to purchase colonial goods until late into the 18th century. But not every native tribe was able to do that. Because even in the negotiations for land between Native Americans and colonists, there was clear inequality and abuse of power. Even if there was little violence from the Europeans, from the British, against the Native Americans. Because this is where we see the ideology of the doctrine of discovery and the divine right of the English settlers coming into play. We're getting a storm and my wall is fluctuating behind me. So we begin to see documentation of this mindset of the English colonists. Starting in the late 1600s through the 1700s, there is documentation of the loss of Indian land to colonists, tract by tract, colony by colony, heading west. And as clarified by historian Stuart Banner, at most times and in most places, the Indians were not exactly conquered, but they did not exactly choose to sell their land either. The truth was somewhere in the middle. Every land transfer of any form included elements of law and elements of power. What do I mean by that? Here are some examples. In 1707, the governor of North Carolina ascribes the thinning of Indians by disease to the hand of God, eminently seen. In 1722, a Puritan minister in Boston justifies the colonists acquiring Indian land for little to no payment. The Indians made no use of it, he asserts, but for hunting. In 1736, Mahomet Wayanoman, a leader of the Mohegans, or Mohicans as we famously call them, in Connecticut, sailed to England to present a petition to King George II, pleading for his royal protection of Indian lands guaranteed by earlier colonial settlers. Not by the Indians, but by earlier colonial settlers. Mahomet died of smallpox before he could present his petition and was buried in England. The appeals persisted until 1772, when Connecticut's claim to the lands was upheld. 1739, a Baptist minister in Rhode Island explains that by driving out and killing the Indians as punishment for their sins, God was pleased to make ready a place prepared as an asylum for the early New English settlers. And there are several more examples of the kind of it's our divine right to take this land from the native people. And God is proving that's true because he's killing them off. That's almost literally what they're saying. So even though the English didn't come to North America with armies and didn't wage a wholesale genocide by military might against native North Americans, they absolutely subscribed to the ideology of the doctrine of discovery, in that they believed it was their divine right to take this land from the Native Americans. They just felt like God was doing the dirty work for them by killing the Native Americans with disease. Because that is how over 90% of the native population of North America died during the settlement of the English colonists. It wasn't by conflict. It wasn't by armed battle. It wasn't by enslavement. It was by disease. mostly a disease called smallpox. So many stories of the decimation of native people by disease reached Europe that English explorers and fishermen worked in the New England waters in the early 1600s, trading and raiding and taking captives. When John Smith explored the islands of Massachusetts Bay in 1614, he noted that he found the inhabitants with a goodly, strong, and well proportioned people. They were a goodly, strong, and well proportioned people. 2 years later, however, an epidemic struck the coast. There's no record of what the epidemic is, but it is recorded that whatever this epidemic was extended from the mouth of the Penobscot River south through Massachusetts to the eastern shore of Narragansett Bay. Thousands of eastern Abenaki, Massachusetts, and Wampanoag Indians died. Whole villages disappeared. Richard Vines spent the winter of 1616 and 1617 with Abenaki Indians near Pemaquid, who had been weakened by war and plague. That's just what they called it. Thomas Dermer, who sailed the coast in 1619, found some ancient plantations, not long since populous, now utterly void. In other places, a remnant remained, but not free of sickness. The disease, whatever it was at the time they didn't know, was still running rampage throughout Indian communities. Dermer had with him Squanto. Remember, I told you Squanto was John Smith's guide. A Wampanoag captured in 1614. He hoped to use Squanto as an interpreter to establish peaceful relations with Squanto's village, the Patuxet. But arriving there and finding all dead, Squanto's entire village had all been wiped out by this mysterious plague. So Thomas Dermer, abandoned his plan. When a small group of religious separatists, the Pilgrims, finally fled England and arrived in Massachusetts in 1620, they found a good harbor, some open fields. They established Plymouth. 3 months later, Squanto arrives at Plymouth. He explained that Patuxet had been wiped out by an epidemic and the Pilgrims had built Plymouth on top of its ruins. Wherever they looked, the Pilgrims found evidence of the devastation. Their governor, William Bradford, described how the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts had been abundantly wasted in the late great mortality. Thousands had died, and not being able to bury one another, their skulls and bones were found in many places lying still above the ground where their houses and dwelling had been. A very sad spectacle to behold. Robert Cushman, who visited Plymouth in the summer of 1621, guessed that the 20th person is scarce left alive. Out of 20 people, 19 died. And the 20th person just barely is left alive. So all of this news finally filters back to England. And when John Winthrop and the leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Company planned their migration in 1692, they wrote extensive arguments to justify their mission. Asked what right they had to settle land occupied by the Indians, they argued in part that God has consumed the natives with a miraculous plague, whereby a great part of the country is left void of inhabitants. They called the decimation of the Native American people a miracle by God. Winthrop led 1,000 colonists to Massachusetts in 1630. 3 years later, smallpox struck. Starting in Plymouth, but spreading quickly throughout Massachusetts, along the Hudson and Mohawk rivers, and to Quebec. Bradford left the most graphic account of the suffering. He said, "A sorer disease cannot befall them. They fear it more than the plague. For usually They that have this disease have them in abundance, and for want of bedding and linen and other helps, they fall into a lamentable condition as they lie on their hard mats, the pox breaking and mattering and running one into another, their skin cleaving by reason thereof to the mats they lie on. When they turn them, a whole side will flay off at once, as it were, and they will be all of a gore blood, most fearful to behold. So when we are talking about the decimation of Native Americans by the British especially, we're not talking about, as I said, the invasion of military. We're not talking about the mass enslavement of a people that was done by the Spanish in the Caribbean, that was done by the Portuguese in Africa. We're talking about disease that Europeans brought with him because they lived in a way that was of close proximity to livestock that Native Americans didn't experience. So they didn't have a natural resistance to smallpox and other diseases that the Europeans brought with them. That is unfortunate. That's certainly not genocide because it wasn't intentional. But what is intentional, what was clearly intentional, was the English settlers taking advantage of the weakened state of the Native American tribes and taking advantage of the kindness they received from friendly tribes who helped them survive when they got here. And it is on this misery, it is on this history of disease and deceit and not honoring trade agreements and deception and the outright theft of land that America was colonized and established by the British. So we've got a few minutes, and I wanted to make this very interesting point. Because very often, people will bring up the idea that Europeans were brought to America as slaves whenever black people talk about slavery. And this is very interesting. This does tie directly into this story because half of that is sort of true. Sort of kind of true. Men and women with little active interest in a new life in America were often induced to make the move to the New World by the skillful persuasion of promoters. William Penn, for example, publicized the opportunities awaiting newcomers to the Pennsylvania colony. Judges and prison authorities offered convicts a chance to migrate to colonies like Georgia instead of serving prison sentences. They don't send us their best people. They send us their rapists. They send us the, where. Yeah. Few colonists could actually finance the cost of passage for themselves and their families to make a start in the new land. So in some cases, ship's captains received large rewards from the sale of service contracts for poor migrants, called indentured servants. And every method from extravagant promises to actual kidnapping was used to take on as many passengers as their vessels could hold. This was what was done in England. In other cases, the expenses of transportation and maintenance were paid by colonizing agencies like the Virginia or Massachusetts Bay Companies. And in return, indentured servants agreed to work for the agencies as contract laborers, usually for 4 to 7 years. Here is where I must pause. This is the difference between indentured servitude and slavery. Indentured servitude is actually a contracted labor agreement that lasts for a specific period of time, and it does end. Slavery, as we know it, is not that at all. Furthermore, free at the end of this term, the former indentured servants would be given freedom dues. They would be paid. Sometimes their freedom dues would actually include a small tract of land in the New World. It's been estimated that half the settlers living in the colonies south of New England came to America under this system. Although most of them fulfilled their obligations faithfully, some ran away from their employers. Nevertheless, many colonies in which they had originally settled, or in the neighbor ones, they were able to secure land and set up homesteads. No social stigma was attached to a family that had its beginning in America under this semi-bondage. Every colony, every single colony had its share of leaders who were former indentured servants. There was one very important exception to this pattern: African slaves. So when people say to you that European immigrants were brought here as slaves, what they really mean is that some European immigrants were brought here as indentured servants. Some of them were gotten onto those ships by duplicitous means, but they were here as indentured servants, and their indentured servitude lasted 4 to 7 years. And at the end of that 4 to 7 years, they were paid their freedom dues, they were paid their wages, and they were given land, and they were allowed to settle that land. African slaves did not have any of those rights. None. The first blacks were brought to Virginia in 1619, just 12 years after the founding of Jamestown. Initially, many were regarded as indentured servants who could earn their freedom. By the 1660s, however, as the demand for plantation labor in the southern colonies grew, the institution of slavery began to harden around them, and Africans were brought to America in shackles for a lifetime of indentured servitude that lasted over 2.5 centuries. I hope you can see through these discussions that all of our history is so interconnected. It does an enormous injustice for us to tell half the truth, because we do that to invalidate the history of another people that we don't want to deal with. So at this point, we are up to about the 1800s in the history of Native Americans. And this is where things do get bloody in the Americas. I'm going to leave you with this comment from one of my favorite movies. It's not a favorite movie because it's wonderful. It's a favorite movie because it is so incredibly, incredibly heartbreaking. And it tells of the final decimation of the Native American people. Popular culture has amplified the scientific claims of Native Americans being savages before European colonization. But in the 2007 HBO documentary Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, Chief Sitting Bull complains to a U.S. Army colonel about whites' violent treatment of the Indians. The colonel retorts, "You were killing each other for hundreds of moons before the first white stepped foot on this continent." I hope that what we discussed tonight will help you see the callous, ridiculous ignorance of that colonel's statement. And I'm sure that you have heard people say to you, well, weren't Indians killing each other before Europeans came? What happened to Indians after Europeans came was much, much worse than any typical tribal rivalry that even occurred in Europe. And what happened to the Native Americans who were left in the 1800s was even worse. I hope you'll join me next week as we talk about that on Brick by Brick with Jacqueline Luqman. Thank you for joining me.
Building it brick by